The musket ball whistled past Major George Washington's ear, splintering the bark of an ancient oak as he crouched behind the makeshift fortification. It was May 28, 1754, and the 22-year-old Virginian had just ignited what would become the greatest conflict the New World had ever witnessed. The smoke from his men's weapons mingled with the morning mist in the Pennsylvania wilderness, marking the moment when two great empires would clash for dominance over an entire continent. The confrontation at Jumonville Glen had begun before dawn. Washington's colonial militia, accompanied by their Seneca allies, led by the half-king Tanacharison, it surrounded the small French reconnaissance party commanded by Ensign Joseph Callan de Jumonville. What followed was a brief but decisive skirmish that would echo through history. Within minutes, Jumonville lay dead, along with 9 of his men. While the survivors were taken prisoner, the French had established their presence in the Ohio Valley through a chain of forts stretching from Lake Erie to the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers converged. Their strategy was clear: control the waterways, control the continent's interior. The British colonists, however, viewed this expansion as a direct threat to their own westward ambitions and the lucrative fur trade that sustained many frontier settlements. Tanacharison, whose Seneca name meant town taker, had his own motivations for aligning with the British. The French had been encroaching on traditional Iroquois hunting grounds, and their military presence threatened the delicate balance of power that had existed for generations among the indigenous nations. As he approached the wounded Jumonville, the half-king's tomahawk fell with decisive force, splitting the French officer's skull and symbolically declaring where his loyalties lay: the Ohio Company of Virginia. A land speculation venture backed by prominent colonial families, including the Washingtons, had been granted rights to vast territories in the Ohio Valley by the British Crown. Their vision of profitable settlements and trade routes now stood in direct opposition to French claims based on exploration and strategic military positioning. The company's influence had been instrumental in securing Washington's appointment to his current mission. As Washington surveyed the aftermath of the skirmish, he understood that this engagement represented far more than a border dispute. The French would interpret Jumonville's death as an act of war, particularly given that the young officer had been carrying diplomatic papers declaring his peaceful intentions. The British would claim they had acted in self-defense against French aggression in territory rightfully belonging to the Crown. The implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In the courts of London and Versailles, this wilderness skirmish would provide the pretext for a global conflict that would reshape the balance of power between two of Europe's greatest empires. The 7 Years' War, as it would come to be known in Europe, would rage across multiple continents. But its origins lay in this remote Pennsylvania clearing where young Washington had fired what some historians would later call the shot heard. Round the world, as the colonial militia prepared to withdraw to their hastily constructed Fort Necessity, Washington penned a dispatch to Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia. His words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. The die had been cast, and the French and Indian War had begun in earnest. The news of Jumonville's death reached Quebec City on June 15, 1754, carried by one of the survivors who had escaped Washington's makeshift prison. Governor-General Marquis Duquesne's face darkened as he read the dispatch, his fingers drumming against the polished surface of his mahogany desk. The British had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and French honor demanded satisfaction. Within hours, Captain Louis Callan de Villiers, brother of the slain Jumonville, was summoned to the governor's mansion. The family resemblance was unmistakable. The same sharp features, the same steely determination that had made the Callan family legendary among the Coureurs de Bois. Duquesne's orders were explicit: assemble a force of French regulars, Canadian militia, and Indian allies, march to the Ohio Valley, and exact revenge for his brother's murder. The French military machine in New France was a formidable entity, built upon decades of wilderness warfare experience. Unlike their British counterparts, who often struggled to adapt European tactics to American conditions, the French had embraced the realities of forest combat. Their officers learned to move silently through dense woodlands, to read the subtle signs of enemy movement, and to coordinate effectively with their indigenous allies. According to records from the Archives nationales in Paris, the French colonial population in 1754 numbered approximately 60,000 souls, compared to over 1 million British colonists along the eastern seaboard. However, this numerical disadvantage was offset by superior strategic positioning and stronger alliances with Native American tribes. The French had cultivated relationships based on mutual respect and shared economic interests, particularly in the fur trade, rather than the land-hungry expansionism that characterized British colonial policy. Meanwhile, in Williamsburg, Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie was mobilizing his own response to the crisis. The House of Burgesses had authorized funds for additional military preparations, and urgent communications were dispatched to other colonial governors requesting assistance. The Albany Congress, convened in June and July of 1754, would attempt to coordinate a unified colonial response to the French threat. Though political divisions among the colonies would prove as challenging as the military situation itself, the indigenous nations found themselves at the center of this European power struggle, their traditional territories becoming battlegrounds for competing imperial ambitions. The Iroquois Confederacy, led by sachems like Hendrik the Onogin of the Mohawks, faced an impossible choice. Their long-standing covenant chain alliance with the British offered certain advantages, but French military success in the Ohio Valley suggested that backing the losing side could prove catastrophic for their peoples. At Fort Necessity, Washington's men worked frantically to strengthen their defenses. The crude stockade, constructed in a marshy clearing that offered little tactical advantage, would have to serve as their last line of defense. The irony was not lost on the young colonel. He had sought to establish British dominance in the Ohio Valley, only to find himself trapped in an indefensible position, awaiting the inevitable French retaliation. The broader implications of the conflict were becoming apparent to military strategists on both sides of the Atlantic. The Ohio Valley represented the key to continental control. Whoever dominated this region would control the vital waterways, connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system, effectively determining the future of North American commerce and settlement patterns as June turned to July. De Villiers assembled his force at Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio. His command consisted of approximately 600 French regulars and Canadian militia, augmented by 100 Indian warriors from various tribes. Their mood was grim, but determined. They marched not merely to secure territory, but to avenge a brother's blood and restore French honor in the wilderness. The stage was set for confrontation that would determine far more than the fate of a few hundred soldiers in a remote Pennsylvania clearing. The rain began falling on July 2nd, 1754, as if the heavens themselves wept for the bloodshed to come. Captain Louis Callan de Villiers peered through the gray morning mist at the pathetic fortification that housed his brother's killers. Fort Necessity squatted in the muddy clearing like a wounded animal, its hastily constructed palisades already showing signs of deterioration from the relentless Pennsylvania weather. Villiers had positioned his force with the precision of a master strategist. His 600 French regulars and Canadian militia, along with their 100 Indian allies, occupied the wooded hills surrounding Washington's position. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. The French could fire down into the fort, while remaining largely protected by the dense forest cover. The young British colonel had chosen his defensive position poorly, and de Villiers intended to exploit every weakness. Inside Fort Necessity, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Washington's force of approximately 400 Virginia militia and South Carolina regulars huddled in the muddy trenches, their gunpowder growing damp in the persistent drizzle. The fort's design was fundamentally flawed. Its location in a natural depression made it vulnerable to the very type of attack de Villiers was now mounting. The British had learned too late that European-style fortifications were ill-suited to American wilderness warfare. The battle commenced at 11 o'clock in the morning, with French and Indian marksmen opening fire from their concealed positions. The sound of musket fire echoed through the forest as bullets splintered the wooden palisades and kicked up spurts of mud within the fort's perimeter. Washington moved among his men, offering encouragement despite the increasingly desperate circumstances. His uniform already stained with mud and his face grim with the realization of their predicament. The French tactical approach demonstrated their superior understanding of American combat conditions. Rather than mounting a costly frontal assault, de Villiers maintained steady pressure through disciplined rifle fire, while his Indian allies used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to harass the British flanks. This strategy minimized French casualties while maximizing the psychological pressure on the trapped colonials. As the hours passed, the British situation became increasingly untenable. Their ammunition was running low, their food supplies were nearly exhausted, and the constant rain had turned their defensive positions into a quagmire. Several of Washington's officers had been wounded, and the men were beginning to show signs of panic. The young colonel faced the harsh reality that his military career and possibly his life hung in the balance. The indigenous warriors fighting alongside the French brought their own tactical expertise to the engagement. Their ability to move silently through the forest, to appear suddenly at unexpected points around the fort's perimeter, and to disappear again before the British could respond effectively, demonstrated why European military commanders had learned to respect and fear wilderness warfare. Their war cries, echoing through the trees, added a psychological dimension to the assault that traditional European tactics could not address. By afternoon, British casualties were mounting steadily. The fort's cramped quarters made it impossible to avoid the French fire entirely, and the wounded were taking up valuable space needed for the defense. Washington's supplies of medical materials were woefully inadequate for the growing list of injured men, and the constant dampness made it difficult to tend to their wounds properly. As evening approached, de Villiers made a tactical decision that would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Rather than risk the heavy casualties that a night assault might entail, he decided to offer Washington terms for surrender. The French captain understood that his strategic objectives could be achieved without unnecessary bloodshed, and he was confident that the British position was hopeless. The negotiations began around 8 o'clock in the evening. Conducted in the flickering light of torches and the persistent rain, Washington, accompanied by his interpreter Jacob Van Braam, met with de Villiers under a flag of truce. The French captain's terms were surprisingly generous. The British would be allowed to withdraw with their weapons and colors, provided they agreed never to return to the Ohio Valley and acknowledge their role in Juneville's death. The document was written in French, which would later prove problematic for Washington's reputation. The surrender document lay before Major George Washington on the rough-hewn table inside Fort Necessity, its French text barely legible in the flickering candlelight. The rain drummed steadily against the fort's sodden walls as Washington studied the terms, his interpreter Jacob Van Braam providing what would prove to be a fatally flawed translation. The word l'assassinat appeared in the document, which Van Braam rendered as killing rather than assassination, a distinction that would haunt Washington for years to come. Captain Louis Callan de Villiers watched with satisfaction as Washington affixed his signature to the capitulation. The French officer had achieved his primary objectives without the costly assault that storming the fort would have required. His brother's death had been acknowledged, French honor had been restored, and the British had been expelled from the Ohio Valley. The document, dated July 4, 1754, would become one of the most controversial surrenders in American military history. The terms of capitulation were surprisingly lenient for 18th century warfare. The British would be allowed to withdraw with their weapons, their colors, and their wounded. They would promise not to return to the Ohio Valley for 1 year and would leave 2 officers as hostages to ensure the safe return of the French prisoners taken at Geminville Glen. For Washington's demoralized and exhausted men, these conditions represented salvation from what had appeared to be certain destruction. The withdrawal began at dawn on July 4th, the bedraggled British column forming up in the persistent rain. The French and their Indian allies watched from the forest as approximately 250 survivors of the original 400-man garrison filed out of the fort. The contrast between the disciplined French forces and the muddy, exhausted British colonials was stark, symbolizing the broader military disparity between the two empires in wilderness warfare. According to historical accounts referenced in Francis Parkman's comprehensive work Montcalm and Wolfe, the retreat to Virginia proved as challenging as the battle itself. The wounded required constant attention, supplies were critically short, and the men's morale had been shattered by their defeat. Washington, at 22 years old, had learned harsh lessons about leadership, logistics, and the realities of frontier warfare that would serve him well in future conflicts. The political ramifications of the Fort Necessity defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In London, news of the surrender was received with considerable alarm by the Duke of Newcastle's administration. The British had been outmaneuvered not only militarily, but diplomatically, as Washington's signature on the surrender document appeared, to acknowledge British responsibility for initiating hostilities through Jumonville's assassination. The French victory at Fort Necessity demonstrated the effectiveness of their strategic approach to North American warfare. By combining European military discipline with wilderness tactics learned from their indigenous allies, they had created a formidable military force uniquely adapted to American conditions. This success would encourage further French expansion and strengthen their alliances with Native American tribes throughout the Great Lakes region, the indigenous nations observed these events with keen interest as the outcome would significantly influence their own strategic calculations. The French victory suggested that backing the British might prove a losing proposition. While French military success offered potential advantages in terms of trade relationships and protection from British colonial expansion, the Iroquois Confederacy, in particular, would need to reconsider their traditional alliance with the British Crown. For the French colonial administration, the victory represented vindication of their strategic investments in wilderness warfare capabilities. Governor-General Duquesne's policies of constructing a chain of forts throughout the Ohio Valley and maintaining strong alliances with indigenous peoples had proven their worth. The relatively small French colonial population had demonstrated that superior tactics and strategic positioning could overcome numerical disadvantages. The defeat marked a turning point in Washington's military education. The young Virginian had learned that European military traditions were insufficient for American warfare, that indigenous allies were essential for success, and that logistics and positioning were often more important than courage or determination. These lessons would prove invaluable during his later career as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The broader implications of the Fort Necessity campaign were becoming apparent to military planners on both sides of the Atlantic, setting the stage for an escalating conflict that would reshape the North American continent. The news of Washington's surrender reached London in late August 1754. It was carried by swift packet ships that had crossed the Atlantic in record time. In the oak-paneled chambers of Whitehall, the Duke of Newcastle's cabinet convened an emergency session, their faces grim as they absorbed the full implications of the colonial defeat. The French had not merely won a skirmish, they had humiliated British arms and called into question the Crown's ability to protect its American subjects. King George II, despite his advancing years, grasped the strategic significance of the Ohio Valley defeat with remarkable clarity. The German-born monarch had witnessed firsthand the rise of French power under Louis XV, and he understood that allowing French expansion in America to go unchallenged would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the two empires. His decision to dispatch regular British forces to America marked a dramatic escalation in what had previously been considered a colonial frontier dispute. The appointment of Major General Edward Braddock to command the North American expedition reflected the Crown's determination to restore British prestige through overwhelming force. Braddock, a 60-year-old veteran of European campaigns, brought with him the rigid discipline and tactical orthodoxy that had served the British Army well in Flanders and Germany. His commission included not only military authority, but also the diplomatic responsibility of coordinating colonial efforts and managing relations with indigenous allies. The logistical challenges of mounting a major military expedition across the Atlantic were staggering. British Admiralty had to coordinate the transport of 2 regiments of regular infantry, along with their artillery, ammunition, and supplies for an extended campaign. The 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot totaling approximately 1,400 men, would form the core of Braddock's force, supplemented by colonial militia and specialized units recruited for wilderness warfare. According to documentation from the British National Archives, the expedition's budget exceeded £100,000, an enormous sum for 18th-century military operations. This investment reflected the Crown's recognition that the American theater had become central to British strategic interests, not merely a peripheral colonial concern. The stakes were nothing less than control of the North American interior and the vast economic opportunities it represented. Braddock's arrival in Alexandria, Virginia, in February 1755, marked the beginning of the most ambitious British military operation in American history to that point. The general's first priority was to coordinate with colonial governors and assess the resources available for his campaign. His meetings with Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia, Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, and other colonial officials revealed the complex political dynamics that would complicate military planning throughout the war. The recruitment of colonial forces proved more challenging than anticipated. While the individual colonies had agreed in principle to support the expedition, their contributions fell far short of promised levels. Pennsylvania's Quaker-dominated assembly was reluctant to fund military operations, while other colonies questioned whether they should bear the costs of defending Virginia's territorial claims. These disputes highlighted the fundamental weakness of British colonial administration, the lack of unified command and common purpose among the separate colonies. The indigenous diplomatic situation was equally complex. The Iroquois Confederacy, led by sachems like Hendrik Thyanoguine, demanded significant concessions in exchange for their military support. They wanted guarantees that British victory would not result in unlimited colonial expansion into traditional hunting grounds, and they insisted on maintaining their role as intermediaries between the Crown and other Native American nations. These negotiations required delicate balancing of competing interests and promises that would prove difficult to fulfill. Braddock's tactical planning reflected his European military background and his confidence in the superiority of regular troops over colonial militia and irregular forces. His strategy called for a methodical advance through the Pennsylvania wilderness, using superior firepower and discipline to overcome French resistance. The construction of a military road suitable for artillery transport was considered essential. Despite the enormous logistical challenges this would entail, the French response to intelligence reports of Braddock's preparations was swift and decisive. Governor-General Duquesne ordered the reinforcement of Fort Duquesne with additional regular troops and artillery, while his agents worked to strengthen alliances with Ohio Valley tribes. The French understood that the approaching British expedition represented an existential threat to their position in the American interior, and they prepared to meet it with all available resources. As spring turned to summer in 1755, both empires were mobilizing for what would become the decisive campaign of the early war period. With the fate of continental control hanging in the balance, the sound of axes echoed through the Pennsylvania wilderness as Major General Edward Braddock's expedition carved its way toward Fort Duquesne in June 1755. The British force, now numbering approximately 2,200 men, moved with agonizing slowness through the dense forest. Their progress measured in miles per day rather than the swift marches Braddock had envisioned. The general's insistence on building a proper military road capable of supporting artillery wagons had transformed what should have been a rapid strike into a laborious engineering project. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, aide-de-camp, despite his recent defeat at Fort Necessity, watched the proceedings with growing unease. The young Virginian's experience in wilderness warfare had taught him that European military conventions were ill-suited to American conditions, but his attempts to share these insights with Braddock met with polite dismissal. The general's confidence in regular troops and conventional tactics remained unshakable. Despite warnings from colonial officers and Indian scouts, the expedition's composition reflected the challenges of 18th-century coalition warfare. The core of Braddock's force consisted of the 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot, disciplined regulars who had served with distinction in European campaigns. These were supplemented by colonial militia units from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, whose military experience varied widely. The integration of these different military traditions proved more difficult than anticipated, with regular officers often expressing contempt for colonial fighting methods. The logistical nightmare of moving such a large force through wilderness terrain was unprecedented in British military experience. The expedition required hundreds of horses and wagons to transport artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, and provisions for an extended campaign. The road construction alone consumed enormous resources, as engineers struggled to create passages suitable for heavy cannon through mountainous terrain covered by virgin forest. Benjamin Franklin, serving as Pennsylvania's agent for securing transportation, had warned Braddock that the expedition's reliance on conventional European military methods would prove disastrous in American conditions. Franklin's observations, later recorded in his autobiography, proved remarkably prescient regarding the tactical vulnerabilities of the British approach. However, his suggestions for adopting more flexible formations and embracing indigenous warfare methods were rejected by the general staff. The intelligence situation was equally problematic. While Braddock had secured the services of several experienced scouts, including Christopher Gist and other frontier veterans, the expedition's intelligence network was inadequate for the challenges they faced. The French had cultivated extensive relationships with indigenous peoples throughout the Ohio Valley, providing them with detailed information about British movements while denying similar intelligence to their enemies. As the expedition approached Fort Duquesne in early July, the tactical situation was becoming increasingly perilous. Captain Daniel Beaujeu, the French commander, had assembled a force of approximately 900 men, including French regulars, Canadian militia, and Indian warriors from multiple tribes. The strategy was based on intimate knowledge of the terrain and the tactical advantages offered by wilderness fighting methods. The French decision to abandon conventional defensive tactics in favor of an aggressive ambush represented a fundamental shift in North American military thinking. Rather than awaiting siege within Fort Duquesne's walls, Beaujeu planned to attack the British column while it was strung out along the forest road, unable to deploy effectively or bring its superior firepower to bear. This approach maximized French advantages while negating British strengths. The indigenous warriors accompanying the French force brought specialized knowledge that would prove decisive in the coming engagement. Their understanding of forest warfare, their ability to move silently through dense undergrowth, their skill at coordinating attacks from multiple directions represented tactical capabilities that European SLA military training had not addressed. The Shawnee, Delaware, and Ottawa warriors, who comprised the majority of the Indian force, were fighting not merely as French allies, but as defenders of their homeland against British expansion. On July 8, 1755, as Braddock's column approached the Monongahela River crossing, the general remained confident in his force's ability to sweep aside French resistance. His battle plan called for a conventional European-style assault on Fort Duquesne, supported by heavy artillery and executed with the precision that had brought success in previous campaigns. The possibility that the French might abandon defensive positions in favor of wilderness tactics had not been seriously considered. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in North American military history, an engagement that would demonstrate the fundamental incompatibility between European and American warfare methods and reshape the strategic balance between the competing empires. The morning of July 9th, 1755, dawned clear and humid as Major General Edward Braddock's column approached the Monongahela River crossing, just 8 miles from Fort Duquesne. The British advance guard, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, forded the river without opposition, their confidence buoyed by the apparent absence of French resistance. The scarlet uniforms of the regulars presented a magnificent sight in the dappled forest sunlight, their polished muskets and gleaming bayonets reflecting centuries of military tradition and discipline. Captain Daniel Beaujeu had positioned his force with masterful precision along the forest road that the British must traverse. His 900 men, including 72 French regulars, 146 Canadian militia, and 637 Indian warriors were concealed in the dense undergrowth on both sides of the narrow path. The French captain wore the war paint of his indigenous allies, a symbolic gesture that reflected his complete embrace of American fighting methods over European military conventions. The collision came suddenly and catastrophically. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the British advance guard rounded a bend in the forest road and found themselves face to face with Beaujeu's force. The French captain fell in the first volley, but his death only seemed to inspire his men to greater ferocity. The forest erupted in musket fire and war cries as the hidden French and Indian forces opened their devastating ambush. The British regulars, trained for European battlefields where enemies fought in ordered formations, found themselves completely unprepared for the chaos of wilderness warfare. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, firing from behind trees and rocks, appearing suddenly to scalp the wounded, then vanishing again into the green gloom of the forest. The rigid discipline that had served them so well in Flanders became a fatal liability in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Lieutenant Colonel Gage's advance guard was shattered within minutes, survivors fleeing back toward the main column in complete disorder. Their panic spread through the ranks like wildfire, as disciplined soldiers who had never faced such fighting methods found their courage evaporating in the face of an enemy they could barely see. The famous British steadiness, built upon decades of European warfare, crumbled under the unprecedented stress of forest combat. Braddock himself rode forward to rally his men, his imposing figure unmistakable in his general's uniform as he attempted to restore order to the chaos. The 60-year-old veteran had never faced an enemy like this, but his courage was undeniable as he exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire while trying to organize a coherent defense. His aide-de-camp, George Washington, had 2 horses shot from under him, carrying the general's orders through the deadly crossfire. The tactical situation was hopeless from the beginning. The British column was strung out along a narrow forest road, unable to deploy into battle formation or bring their artillery to bear effectively. The French and Indian forces, intimately familiar with the terrain and fighting methods perfectly suited to the conditions, could attack from any direction while remaining largely invisible to their enemies. European military doctrine had no answer to such tactics. The slaughter continued for 3 hours, the British casualties mounting steadily while their enemies remained largely untouched. The forest floor became carpeted with scarlet uniforms, as companies that had served with distinction in European campaigns were systematically destroyed by an enemy they could not see or effectively engage. The sound of war whoops and musket fire echoed through the trees, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the panicked neighing of horses. As the afternoon wore on, Braddock's attempts to maintain order became increasingly desperate. The general had 4 horses shot from under him before a musket ball finally found its mark, shattering his spine and leaving him mortally wounded. His fall marked the effective end of British resistance, as the surviving officers struggled to organize a retreat from the killing ground that the forest road had become. The retreat quickly became a rout, with the survivors abandoning their artillery, supplies, and wounded comrades in their desperate flight back toward the Monongahela crossing. The French and Indian forces pursued relentlessly, taking scalps and prisoners, while the British army, that had marched so confidently into the wilderness, dissolved into a mob of terrified fugitives. The defeat was so complete that it would reshape military thinking on both sides of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Monongahela, as it came to be known, had demonstrated with brutal clarity that European military methods were not merely inadequate for American conditions, they were potentially suicidal. The French and their indigenous allies had not merely won a victory, they had revealed the fundamental weakness of British colonial strategy and military doctrine. The road to Fort Duquesne had become a pathway to disaster, littered with the dreams of empire and the bodies of those who had believed in the invincibility of European arms. The war was far from over, but the balance of power in North America had shifted dramatically in France's favor, setting the stage for years of conflict that would ultimately determine the fate of 2 empires and the future of an entire continent.